This is meant to be a practical look at CP from someone who knows it best. I'm not a physician, or a clinician, or some PhD. I'm just a guy. But I've lived with CP, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 38 years. So if you ever want to get a real good handle on a particular disability, read all the books and papers you can find. But then learn from someone who actually lives with the disability. That will allow you to blend the clinical data with the practical data into what I call a usable knowledge. Very quickly, my day job is in assistive technology. For those of you who may not know, assistive technology is any tool or technology a person with a disability uses to accomplish a task. Perfect examples are my wheelchair, my communication device, my accessible van. I have a small screwdriver that I use to open soda cans, plastic bags, and other packages. So assistive technology could be literally anything, and is bound only by our imagination. Okay, down to business. I want to look at CP from head to toe, stopping at common areas that are affected by CP, and discussing strategies and technologies used either to compensate or enhance function of those areas. In my opinion, functionality is key when discussing CP. We cannot fix CP. We cannot avoid it. We definitely cannot restrain it. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes. We have to work with it, figure it out, in order to use it to the person's advantage, to accomplish functionality. It doesn't matter how many times you see cerebral palsy, it's always going to manifest itself differently. Did I say always? Just in case I didn't, always. Which brings me very nicely to the first body part, affected by CP. This is where it all starts. And this is why CP will always manifest itself differently. No two brains have ever, or will ever, be the same. Everybody knows the difference between analog and digital signals. Digital is very uniform, standardized, identical. Analog is always unique, even if it looks similar. There's always variations that have never been seen before. Our brains, by nature, are analog, unique, one of a kind. Therefore, when you add on CP, which is also an analog disability, you have an even more unique situation. And this is where most professionals stumble over their own feet. They may have client after client with CP, who have cognitive issues of some kind. So when I roll up in their office, they assume that I also have the same issues. And a lot of times, they cannot, or will not, release that assumption, even after I tell them I have an IQ of 147, and that they need to treat me accordingly. They seem to be unable to adapt their interactions to that fact. Couple years ago, I had a physical therapist who had decades of experience, and she refused to treat me like a grown man. So I'm like, no, just no. I have to deal with that behavior out in the real world. But I will not tolerate that from someone who should know better, and someone who I'm paying to help me. So I try to tell every student who will be in contact with the population of people with disabilities 2 basic rules that will keep them out of that kind of trouble. Assume that every person with a disability is a genius until they tell you otherwise. Assume that every person with a disability can do everything for themselves until they tell you otherwise. The idea is that it's safer, it's easier, to assume the best or the highest, and then adjusting according to what that particular person is showing. Coming from the opposite direction will probably offend the person, and from my experience, it's more difficult for a professional to allow their expectations to be raised than to be lowered. Sensory issues are very common with CP in general. Visual deficits are the most common, and the extent can be very severe, to the point of legal blindness. Many times the issue isn't with the actual eyes, or the ears, for that matter. It's in the brain's ability to process that huge deluge of information constantly flooding in. Most of us can process, filter, and immediately utilize that massive information, without much conscious thought. It's not so automatic for many people with CP. More so with visual processing, but sometimes hearing loss is present. And sometimes auditory processing, especially in crowded areas or high frequencies, can be a challenge and sometimes painful. We're kind of dipping into some autism challenges, and some of the techniques and strategies we use with autism can be used or adapted to improve function with CP. Now I wear headphones as much as possible at work. I don't actually have any auditory issues, but I do work in an office full of women. But if I cannot physically groom my beard the way I want it to look, and I can communicate that desire, that information, to someone else, they can do it for me. Even if I can do everything for myself. We are, by nature, a social species. Very few of us prefer a life of solitude. Our lives are immeasurably enriched from the exchange of ideas, beliefs, dreams, aspirations. Sharing, that's what I'm getting at, sharing of information. So your client's ability to communicate their thoughts, in my opinion, should be the highest priority. And nowadays, we have so many methods of functional communication, both verbal and nonverbal. The elephant in the room being the internet, but also nonverbal communication. Communication devices that display pictures and symbols are another example of nonverbal communication. And those are a mainstay for us, because many of our students are at a functional level where independently structuring sentences can be very difficult. I'm rambling on about communication because I want to impress upon you how crucial it is for a person with a disability. Self-determination, which is the ultimate goal, begins with the ability to communicate who you are. So upper extremities is the next major area. This is a very important area, especially for those who are ambulatory. If they are in manual wheelchairs, their arms, and especially their shoulders will be very important. Although I'm in the power chair, manipulating my environment and everything in it is done by my arms. So I focus a lot of attention on keeping my arms in good shape. I'm in the gym all the time, keeping my arms strong and flexible. And for me, that has been more beneficial than any therapy. Because I know my body better than anyone else, I can push myself beyond what a therapist would see as being safe. Again, it's all about functionality. The more strength and flexibility I can gain, the more functional I'll be. I want to talk about muscle memory. It's a concept that is very important to me personally, living with CP. The premise is one that athletes swear by. Correctly performing the same movements repeatedly builds a kind of muscle memory. The goal is to be able to perform those movements without having to think about it. That allows the athlete to be faster and to free up their concentration for other tasks. Well, in my world, muscle memory has a similar function, but for different reasons. For me, I'm trying to compensate for a poor connection between my brain and my muscles. So, for example, I had to develop muscle memory while I'm driving. This was the procedure that I had to repeat. Most people can do this without even thinking about it. But again, coordination is challenging for us, especially bilaterally. The key here was for me to perform these steps correctly. And sometimes, I might have to practice these steps separately. And maybe have to do this at half speed to break up or compensate for any spasticity that occurs. Doesn't matter. What matters is that I perform them correctly. Otherwise, I'm developing bad muscle memory. It's kind of like developing good or bad habits. The goal was for me to perform this whole procedure without any apprehension, with total confidence, and with very little concentration. That allows me to have my eyes out the windshield and in my mirrors. Just like the athlete, I want this to be effortless, so I can concentrate on more important things. So muscle memory is definitely one of my favorite strategies to enhance function with CP. Do you want to know what took longer than learning how to do this sequence? building this one freaking slide. Next is our core. I feel like a broken record, but this is a very important area. But for me, it kind of dictates what I can do with my arms. This is less of an issue for those of us who are ambulatory. But for most of us in wheelchairs, our trunk control is significantly lacking. This is obviously even more prevalent for those with attitoid CP. You'll see a lot of leaning, especially when we're trying to concentrate on another task. That multitasking thing I mentioned earlier also applies here. Verbal reminders to sit up can be helpful. But sometimes telling us to sit up all the time becomes annoying for us. Got to remember that our bodies work very differently than the average person. What looks uncomfortable and unconducive to task completion may be the opposite for us. Like I said, it's not about fixing us, not even about making us function like everyone else. It's about us functioning, period. It's like standing on your feet all day. You best have really comfortable shoes, or you're probably not going to be a happy camper. But most people aren't actually on their feet from the time they get out of bed until they go back to bed. Got to remember, I sit in this chair sometimes 20 hours a day, non-stop. Above all else, it better be comfortable. In all actuality, I should have a lap belt, chest strap, lateral supports that would hold me up straight, a molded seat to keep my hips in line, and even foot straps to keep my feet still. Another little nugget of information. Trying to restrain spastic CP is a very bad idea. Alignment of our hips is very important for function, but also for comfort. When we get down into the thighs, muscles and tendons can be pretty powerful. And for us, those can pull bones out of alignment, or even completely out of socket. So intervention is imperative to either restore, maintain, or improve function. That can be accomplished by either stretching those muscle and tendons, strengthening the opposing muscles, and finally surgery. There have been recent studies suggesting that stretching, for people with spastic CP, has no real long-term benefit to flexibility or function. I can kind of see that if the stretching is being done by a clinician twice a week. That probably won't be enough to see improvement. But if it's being done every day, maybe passive prolonged stretching, I would never discourage that. I've seen benefits from stretching my hips as far as being comfortable in my wheelchair. I've also seen benefits from getting in the pool. Being neutrally buoyant allows me to run in place with resistance. I happened to tell one of my last physical therapists about that. She decided to make the very disrespectful assumption that I was just flapping around uncontrollably, like a fish out of water, but in the water. On the contrary, I have worked very hard and gotten pretty good at nice slow controlled strides. And that has helped me maintain alignment, increase flexibility, increase strength especially in my legs, increase control and function, and has given me a little shape back there, which is never a bad thing. For us wheelchair users with spastic CP, you'll sometimes see a phenomenon that I call happy legs. When we get happy, excited, or even startled, our legs will just pop out and say hello. That's a classic sign of CP. And I would highly recommend that you never stand right in front of someone with spastic CP. We can sometimes kick pretty hard. Unless our legs are strapped down to the wheelchair. Told you I'd come back to that. Didn't I say that was a bad idea? Newton's third law of motion. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. If I fire my rifle, the action is that the bullet is coming out the barrel. The reaction is a little kick to my shoulder. Now if I were to block the end of my barrel, will that prevent the bullet from firing? That bullet is going somewhere, I promise you. The energy pushing that bullet isn't going to just disappear. It's going somewhere, though the of least resistance, which would probably be in my face. Bad idea. If you strap down my extremities, the energy behind those muscle spasms will go somewhere else, and will definitely put more stress on my joints. Repeated and excessive stress on my joints. Is that a good idea? Bad idea? This handsome young man in particular. I have to imagine some medical professional told his mother that he should have his arms and legs strapped down, just so he doesn't hurt himself. I make that assumption because my mother was told the same thing. Now, I like to invite those same experts to be strapped down to a chair for 18 hours a day. See if it doesn't frustrate the mess out of them. It took some convincing from me that he would be okay and wouldn't hurt himself. But she finally unleashed this guy. And of course the degree of his spasticity, he was kind of all over the place. I told everybody to stand back and let him figure out how to deal with his body. I could see how he looked at me, that he was a smart young man and could figure out some sort of control, if given the opportunity. Before too long, he was able to control his trunk enough to sit up unsupported and take this awesome picture. I don't know if my personality has affected my CP, or if my CP has affected my personality. But I will not be restrained. I'm one of those people who hates being standard, following everybody else's example, maintaining the status quo. I want to be different, think different, live different. I consider it a complete waste to live my life the exact same way that billions before me have, to follow the same path, to make the same choices, to comply with the same rules and restrictions that others have settled for. Why? This is my life, my choices, and my exploration. So I don't know whether I would have the same rebellious personality if I didn't have CP. But I think having CP kind of fits, and maybe even enhances my personality. CP will never be restrained and stereotyped. And neither will I. I want to thank you for listening to me.